Okay, so essentially what I want to do, it's really hard for me when I was thinking about how I wanted to structure this presentation to just make a presentation with a list of tips, which is more or less kind of what this was turning into. It kind of felt like a bit of a BuzzFeed article. So I decided to kind of couch it within the idea of resilience. It's a very important concept, not just in psychology, but in life. So I'm sure you're all familiar just with the general concept of resilience. Here's sort of the scientific definition of it. It is a positive, and that's an important piece of it, positive, right? Adaptation to some sort of trauma, tragedy, stress, etc. It's not just the feeling of, oh, I feel better now. I've bounced back from this. True resilience typically involves significant personal growth. Now, the reason I want to mention that is for a lot of us here on the Kingwood campus, we've experienced this a little bit already, or a lot of it. I think a lot of us, probably all of us that were here during the Harvey years where we had to go online very suddenly. A lot of us for the very first time, I had never taught online when Harvey took us online. So 3 weeks, right? Had to take 6 courses, put them online. Once we got through that, I think we can all attest to the fact that we did grow from that. We had more resilience. So for example, when COVID comes around mid-March, we come back from spring break or come back right from spring break and we're forced to do that again. For a lot of us, it was much easier, still a lot of work, but a much easier process, potentially less stressful process than it was the first time around. And that's because of the resilience that we had. So when I'm going through these tips, I want to talk about how they can fit into your resilience and help you grow and develop resilience as we continue to navigate the pandemic. And that's not just limited to being potentially a faculty member teaching students. You're going to see most of these are very general level tips. They're not applied to a specific career or specific circumstance. All right, what is not resilient? Well, number one, being resilient doesn't mean you're not going to feel like crap, right? That you're not going to experience stress, difficulty, or nervousness, or feeling overwhelmed. Just because you experience those feelings doesn't mean that you aren't developing resilience. It's a continuum, right? It's not a static thing, and that's the point below. It's not static. It's something that's learned. It's something that's developed. And when it's developed, it's also not something that's permanent, right? You can be resilient Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Thursday you might have a rough day, right? And that's fine. So psychologists, and this is fairly well established research, have identified 4 components that we know help us build and maintain our resilience. I'm going to give you a brief definition of these, and you'll see how I sort of fit them into the tips I'm going to discuss. Connection, you're going to see that's problematic given the current circumstance. Wellness, healthy thinking, and meaning. So starting here with connection. Human beings are inherently social creatures. I think we all know that. Even those of us who are very introverted, and I count myself among that group, extremely introverted, we still need social connection of some form. We are driven to connect with others, even if it's a couple of people. This is especially true during times of stress or trauma. There's been study after study after study that has shown when we are stressed, even if it's just a daily stressor, we seek the comfort of others. Think about your workplaces, right? Typically when you're together with your fellow workers, with your fellow faculty members, whatever it may be, what do you spend a decent amount of your time doing? I know what I do. I'm complaining about stuff, right? I'm talking about students. I'm talking about maybe administration, things that are just driving us crazy. It's commiseration, right? It helps to share that stress. Well, this is difficult when the very thing that's stressing us out, right, given the pandemic, is also the thing that's not allowing us to connect with others, not allowing us to sort of share in that trauma. So the pandemic is presenting a unique difficulty in this regard. So you see several of the tips that I have here are directly related to trying to have that sense of connection in a time when it's an especially difficult process, right, to connect with other people. I mean, just a personal little anecdote here to sort of emphasize the value of being around other people and to connect with other people. I think this was June or July, but it had been months since I had really gone into public in any meaningful way other than to like go to curbside pickup for like some food, right? We needed something from Costco, and I was like, okay, I read their protocols. I feel safe going in there and grabbing something. I walked into Costco and had an emotional experience seeing other people. It was weird. I felt like emotionally overwhelmed. It felt good to be around people while at the same time wanting them to stay away from me. So it's a weird dynamic that we're all sort of navigating right now. All right, the second one here we have is wellness. Now I want to distinguish a little bit between 2 and 3 on this list, wellness and healthy thinking, because they seem like they're the same, but there's this distinction. Wellness is the overall health of our mind and body. And I put there because I can't speak for y'all, but I know for myself, the body part of that probably hasn't been the greatest during the pandemic in terms of sleep, nutrition, exercise, any of those things. Other people have done the opposite and have gotten in like great shape during the pandemic, not me. So the idea here with wellness is not to seek to eliminate stress, because that's just going to cause more stress. You're never going to be able to eliminate the stressors, but to manage it. So you'll see several of the tips we have are aimed at managing that stress. The distinction we have between wellness and healthy thinking is really about trying to prevent spiraling, trying to prevent unhealthy thinking, something that I think we've probably all been guilty of. I know I have some of this irrational thinking that I have up there. For example, the pandemic will never end. Oh, we've got vaccines now, but the rollout is so slow, I'm never going to get one. These kinds of catastrophizing that we tend to do as humans. We do that generally. We're really good at that kind of negative spiraling. That issue's compounded when we're thinking about a literal catastrophe. So it's something that we don't need to exaggerate to make worse. It's already a catastrophe, and that makes that kind of thinking even worse for us. I'll mention in one of the tips that we're going to get to the idea of doom scrolling, which I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with that term by now, but for those of you that aren't, I'll define it for you. It's a term that either didn't exist or wasn't widely used before 2020. So that gives you an idea, right, of what we've been through. So the idea with healthy thinking is to maintain flexibility, accept change, remain hopeful. That all sounds wonderful, right? It'd be great to do all that stuff. I put yikes up there because obviously that is easier said than done, given some of the things that we've been experiencing. All right, and then finally, meaning. The idea that we need to understand our role in helping others. For those of us that are faculty members, that's fairly obvious, right? When we're working with our fellow faculty members and our students, continuing to move toward goals and continuing to look for opportunities for personal growth. So what I'm going to do as I get into these tips, you're going to see I've put 3 tips on each slide. I've got 18 tips that I want to run through here. And I'm one of those people that if someone tells me something, I don't really, especially when it comes to like mental health and wellness and sort of self-help, I'm very skeptical of a lot of those fields. I've put on the slide underneath the tip a term that I call the logic. I've picked tips here that have a basis in science, and I've given you a short 1-sentence summary of what that basis is, why the tip works. Underneath that, I've given you an example of how I've tried to utilize that tip, or potentially how I have failed to utilize that tip or strategy. And then underneath each one of them, you'll see I put share and question mark. Initially, I was going to go through each one of these and ask you to share sort of how you've used that tip or a strategy for using that tip. I decided not to do that for each individual one in the interest of timing this correctly. I want to get through all of them and then at the end, open it up to sharing. But jot one down. If you see a tip that I've gone through that you have utilized or you've got a strategy for utilizing particularly well, jot that down so at the end, when we open it up to discussion, we can talk about those and share some of the strategies.
Let me interject. Just put something for that. Just put it in the chat box and we'll come back to it. Exactly.
Yeah, fantastic. That way we've got a record of it as well. Okay, so tip number 1 here. 18 tips for surviving the pandemic, all right? Create a new routine. I think a lot of us have done this, but for those of you that haven't, different people have different levels of wanting to be routine-based. I am like at the extreme of I need a routine. My routine makes me feel good. The pandemic obviously completely disrupted that routine. But developing a new routine or several routines, depending on what kind of day you're looking at, is helpful to us. One of the reasons it can help us is it gives us a sense of control. Especially now, we're living in a world or a situation where you can feel very helpless. You can feel like you don't have much control over things. So having that sense of predictability gives us that sense of control. I forgot to mention underneath each one of the tips, underneath logic, I put resilience. And what I've done there is listed which aspect of resilience I believe that this tip will help you develop. At the very end, I've got them all listed out together. So I think this will help with wellness and healthy thinking. So my example, this would be on a day where I'm not teaching a face-to-face class. I've got one going this semester. On a normal online work day, let's say not the beginning of a semester, because if it was more toward the beginning of a semester, this part here under example would basically just say coffee and work. because the beginning is mostly work. But once we kind of get into the flow of things, my typical routine is coffee, work, then I read a little bit, have lunch, work some more, play some music, read some more, work, cook dinner. One of the reasons I've shown this example is you'll see work is split up here. I think that's really important for those of us that are teaching online to sort of set that time aside where you're not working, right? Where you've got that kind of mental space that is for you. That's one of the difficulties of working from home, is drawing the distinction between work and home, right? You can get so blurred that you almost feel like you're on call. That's something that I've been guilty of. And it can get really, really hard to turn off that part of your mind that is the work part. Whereas in a normal circumstance, we get in our car, we drive home, and that typically helps. All right, number 2, carve out personal time. Even 10 minutes a day, it doesn't have to be a lot, because it has been shown to reduce stress. Just time that is for you, where you're doing just something completely for yourself. For me, what I do is I spend 15 minutes at the start of every day just sitting outside on the patio drinking coffee. Even days where I've got to go to work and teach my face-to-face class at 9 o'clock. I'll get up a little bit earlier, sit out there, and kind of just get started for the day. Quite frankly, this is easier for me than it would be for a lot of other people. I'm married, but I don't have kids, so I've got a lot of personal time. For those of you who have children, who have a lot going on at home, this might be especially important for you to have those at least of 10 minutes that are just for you. All right, number 3, find a new hobby or project. I'm especially interested here to see maybe what some of y'all have done with this. The reason this helps is this can give us renewed purpose. Now, for those of us that are faculty, one of the things that I derive a lot of purpose from is teaching students and interacting with students. I still get that online. And quite frankly, at the end of last semester, I got more nice emails than I've ever gotten before from students, which was great. But it's still not the same. For me, it's just not the same as having that interaction, that face-to-face interaction, that face-to-face discussion. So I feel like I've lost a sense of that kind of purpose. Finding a new avenue to channel some of that energy into can be very helpful. For me, I've begun learning several new instruments. I've played guitar for years, but I've bought a lot of new stringed instruments that I am attempting to learn how to play. Some well, some not so well. I've also developed some new reading interests as well. So that's something that I've been able to sort of channel some of that extra, energy is not the right word, but need for purpose into. All right, number 4, with connection. I'm sure you've all done this in some form or another, but I want to give you maybe a little bit less obvious tip here when I say connect virtually. Obviously, we're all familiar with Zoom meetings and WebEx meetings that allow us to connect. To a certain point, we get overload with those, so those are good. They're helpful to have that connection, or a weekly game night with people, or those sorts of things. What's also really good and really basic, and I have found this helped me a lot, is this down here, just text check-ins, or just little even emails to people that you normally might interact with on a day-to-day basis, your coworkers, your friends that you haven't seen, just to share something funny, to share an interesting story that you found. I have found that it has helped me stay sane in a lot of ways. I text several of my coworkers very frequently just to sort of have that kind of social interaction you might normally have that you're not going to have when you're more homebound. All right, number 5, maintaining healthy habits. You're probably aware of this. It's something we all know, but physical health is very related to mental health. So we want to try to take care of ourselves as much as possible. Some people have done really well with this. Other people, like myself, I'll admit to it, haven't been great. I've maintained my healthy eating habits, but I've developed some other habits that maybe aren't the best. I'll leave it at that. One thing I'll put up here is to, especially if you're experiencing a lot of anxiety or you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed, to try to avoid stimulants like caffeine, right, as much as possible. I'm not saying don't have your morning cup of coffee, but if you're feeling stressed and anxious and overwhelmed, that second, third, fourth, fifth cup ain't going to help, right? That's going to make it worse. You're not going to feel particularly good if you do that. I've cut down on my coffee consumption to where I only have it in the morning, and that has helped me. All right, at the same time, we also want to give ourselves some leeway. So treat yourself, right? This is helpful just to give yourself something to look forward to. A lot of people have had the things that they value in their day-to-day lives, the things that bring them happiness, disrupted, right? Whether that's interacting with other people, whether that's going to a gym, whether that's social events. For me, it's been traveling. I love to travel. My wife is a middle school English teacher, so we have the same breaks. So we travel all the time. Usually we'll take 3 or 4 international trips a year. Obviously that has not happened, right? We were actually in Spain over spring break, and we're part of the rush to get back here when I got a call from my dad at 3 in the morning with some very confusing information about what was going to happen to people that were in Europe at the time. Since that point, right, we haven't traveled out of the country. We did a socially distant road trip this summer where we drove around to national parks, which was great, but it's the only trip we've taken. So that thing that really makes me happy and gives me something to look forward to, these landmarks to look forward to, has been disrupted. So giving yourself day-to-day things to look forward to in the form of treating yourself in some way can be helpful. And I just put on there that I have. And I'll leave it to y'all to figure out how I've done that. All right, number 7. This is an especially important one, given some of my coworkers that I've talked to, and especially myself. I think a lot of us have had a similar mindset. Keep perspective. It might not feel like it, but this will end. It will be over at some point. I mean, if you listen to the scientists, COVID is going to be with us forever, obviously, but the pandemic will end at some point. We will return to, I don't want to say a new normal because I'm tired of hearing that phrase, but some sense of normalcy. Keeping this in mind can prevent that spiral of negativity. Trying to predict when it will end is a fool's errand, because I have done that numerous times and I've been wrong every single time. I remember when we left for spring break, I had a student that sat in the back of my class, and she asked me point blank when we left, she goes, "Are you concerned about this at all?" And I go, "No, we'll be fine. Don't worry about it." Clearly, I could not have been more wrong, right? So my ignorance was like at a level 100 at that point. So I've learned not to try to predict it. It's not helpful. Just keep in mind that it will end at some point. For me, given that I mentioned I love traveling, I've been imagining future trips that we will take. Trying not to put a time frame on when those will happen, because I don't know, but imagining those future trips. All right, number 8, help someone out. Again, for those of us that are faculty, I think we do this all the time, but when you're really able to reach someone or help someone, your brain responds well to this. You get essentially a miniature high. You get a neurochemical stimulation. It rushes dopamine into your brain, it rushes serotonin into your brain. It makes you feel good. Some of the emails, again, that I got at the end of last semester with students willing to share some of the personal struggles that they had during the semester with money, jobs, family members who had died of COVID, other personal tragedies, and then saying that like listening to my lectures in their class made them feel better, or like our ability to reach out to them makes them feel better. That makes us feel good, right? That makes us feel great. It helps us connect in a different way. And again, I think we all do this with our students. It's helpful to share, or not to share, but to keep those emails, to keep those nice notes you get from people, because if you're having a bad day, if you're feeling down, going back and reading through those can provide you with a little bit of a boost. All right, number 9, get outside, especially right now, maybe not literally today, but this time of year is typically the nicest weather we've got. So being outside even 10 to 15 minutes a day, seeing some sunlight, getting some sunlight is extremely beneficial to our mental health. This is trickier in the summer when it's 95 degrees and humid, but just getting outside, and even if you're just sitting there for a while, can feel good. I read outside all the time, go on walks around our neighborhood. I mentioned the road trip we took this summer. Being outside, it can kind of help us connect in a way that is a little bit less obvious, which is why I put connection up here, because your ability to connect with nature also makes you feel connected in just a general sense, even if it's not other people. It makes you feel connected to a world that exists outside of the bubbles that we're all living in, right? It helps you kind of pop out of that bubble in a safe way. All right, number 10, limit your screen time. We're all teaching online, right? We're taking classes online or whatever. So we're all kind of living in this virtual nightmare already. So don't engage yourself virtually more than you need to, right? It's helpful to get away from that computer screen, to get away from your phone for a while. If I'm going to engage myself in some other activity like reading or playing an instrument or whatever, I'll move my phone out of the way just so it's not even there. So if a text pops up, I don't even know. I turn it off. I turn it on silent. I'm like, look, I'll get back to you in the next 30 minutes or an hour. It'll be fine. They don't need to hear back immediately. So disengaging from that virtual world can help. Emphasizing your personal space. This kind of goes back to the carving out alone time, but this is especially true for those of you who have children, who live in a large household, right? Saying, look, I need some space that is mine. I need some space for me. This helps prevent a cascade of stressors. This is a well-known psychological effect I'm sure you've all experienced, where stress builds, right? And what eventually breaks you often isn't a major stressor. It could be something tiny, right? But it's that tiny little sprinkle on top, that tiny little added stressor that causes you to just snap, right? And things get escalated, whether you feel bad or it results in an argument, or you're driving down the road, right? And someone cuts you off and you lose your mind. I've never done that, right? It's that little thing that's not a big deal, but it's added on top of everything else that ends up sort of causing the snap. Again, for me, this is fairly easy because it's just my wife and I, so I have plenty of personal space. I'd like to hear when we get to the share some strategies for people who don't maybe have that kind of space, what they've been able to do. Number 12, acknowledge growth. Just know that when this does end, because it will end, you will be more resilient than you ever were before. I'm trying to think of something that could be tossed at us that would be more difficult on a large level, obviously personal tragedies aside, but on a large level than this. And I'm not sure there's much. So if you can handle this, you're going to be prepared for whatever happens down the road, because things have been more disrupted than ever, more disrupted than several generations. And again, for those of us that experienced Harvey, I just constantly remind myself, once we got back to kind of a normal situation after Harvey, which only lasted like a year before this happened, how easy things felt. It just felt like everything was so much easier. It's almost like maybe I had taken it for granted, or perhaps it was the new skills I had acquired because of Harvey that made things feel better. And that's that resilience that we can attain through triumph over tragedy. All right, number 13. This is one I'm terrible at. Some of you are probably pretty bad at it too. Limit your news intake. I'm not saying to be uninformed. Please be informed. But that doesn't mean you need to be reading the news every second of every day. This is the doom scrolling that I mentioned. For those of y'all that aren't familiar with the term, it's the idea that you're just scrolling through negative news story after negative news story. Reading that over and over and over again has basically no consequence other than to put you in a negative mindset. So I've tried, I'm getting a little bit better at it. I've tried to set about like 2 periods during the day where I'll read through the news. Rather than checking Washington Post like 50 times during the day, I'll like wake up in the morning, look at it, and in the evening I'll take a look at it and read through some stories versus constantly doing it throughout the day. Number 14, I think this one's really important. I probably should have made this one number 1. These are in no particular order, by the way. Recognize that feeling bad is normal and okay. Part of the issue here is because we are so biologically driven for social connection, when we don't get it, number 1, that's going to make us feel kind of crappy. Number 2, it's not going to allow us as much to realize how other people might not be feeling particularly good as well, which just leads to an enhanced feeling of social isolation. So that idea of connecting and checking in on other people, sharing your feelings, helps emphasize just how normal it is. Everyone's feeling that way. I've sent plenty of texts to my coworkers about something that's happened that just says, well, this sucks. And they're like, yep. And just knowing that they're feeling the same thing that you're feeling can be very helpful. It makes you feel a little bit less alone in knowing that you're trying to navigate through some of those negative feelings. We don't need to be happy all the time. We want to be happy, but pressuring yourself to be happy is a recipe for disaster. All right, this seems like a really basic one, but I think it's important. Listen to music. Music has a robust and empirically proven impact on your mood. Sometimes I'll notice that I haven't listened to music throughout the day, which is weird because normally I have it on pretty much all day when I'm working. And I'm like, I don't feel very good. Turn the music on, and it will at least temporarily make me feel much better. It also just helps to kind of filter out what can be overwhelming silence. If you're working virtually and you're sort of stuck in that virtual bubble, it helps with wellness. All right, last 3 tips before we open it up here to conversation. Number 16, read. I have to admit, I have, up until relatively recently in my life, been very bad about this. I don't think I read a single book for pleasure from middle school, maybe through age 30. I'm 35 now. For those of you that know anything about me, that might be surprising because my office, kind of like John's background right now, is covered in books. My bedroom right now is floor to ceiling bookshelves with thousands of books on them. Once I start doing something, I really start doing it. And I became obsessed with reading once I finally started. And there's a good reason to be obsessed with it. Cognitively, there are very few, if any, activities that you can do to engage your brain as diffusely, as diversely as reading. Reading engages at least 7 distinct regions of your brain, and in fact, much more than that if you drill down some of the smaller regions on a smaller scale. So I've set aside quite a bit of time when I can during the day to read whatever I'm reading, fiction and nonfiction. during the day, just because I feel like it helps me relax. For other people, it might be kind of like a meditation. Like I don't meditate, but reading makes me feel like I'm meditating. It's a good release for me to kind of escape from the world. All right, number 17, take a break. This is especially true for those days where you're working a lot on the computer. I'm thinking for me, especially like August and January, I will work 10 hours a day on the computer because I really like to get my classes completely set up and ready to go so that I don't have to worry about some of that functionality during the semester. It's really important to just stop during the day for a while, no matter what you're doing, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes. When I'm on campus, like when I used to teach face-to-face full load, right? I would take 5 to 10 minutes just to walk around CLA once, just to get out of my office. It's the same kind of logic, right? That will reduce mental exhaustion. It will reduce burnout. It can be 5 minutes just to push away from your computer and go and just look at something. I've listed my example down there. Sometimes I'll go out onto our patio and I'll just stare off into space. I won't read. I won't do anything. I won't be thinking about anything. I'll just stare off into space. And that can be helpful just to give your brain a break, just to relax a little bit. And this last one's something I talk to my students about. I think a lot of people are more aware of this now, but it bears mentioning, especially for those of you that might be struggling with sleep because of stress and anxiety. Watch that blue light. What I mean by that is watch the media that you are engaging with before you go to bed, computers, TVs, phones. Light in general has a negative impact on sleep. Part of the reason why is artificial light destroys melatonin. Melatonin is the hormone released at night, right, that makes us sleepy, that makes it easier for us to go to sleep. So if you've got a phone in front of your face, those wavelengths that are going into your eye are counterproductive. They're making it more difficult for you to fall asleep. Blue light is worse than yellow light. It's shorter, higher energy wavelengths, right? Which is why a lot of your phones, maybe all of them at this point, mine does this, automatically converts to like a more of an amber glow when the sun goes down. That amber glow isn't totally non-destructive though. It's better than the blue light, but it's best just like to try to put that thing down 15 to 20 to 30 minutes before you want to go to sleep, because it'll make it typically easier for you to fall asleep and get the sleep that is so important to our wellness and our health. So this slide is one where I've taken all of the tips that I've talked about and I've put them into the 4 categories that we know are helpful for building resilience: connection, wellness, healthy thinking, and meaning. And obviously these could be moved around. These are just kind of where I thought they fit, and you'll see there's several repeats in there. But it's kind of a nice little cheat sheet of the tips to think about what can we do to build each of these 4 things that will in turn help us build our resilience, that will help us grow from having experienced this all. Okay, so with that out of the way, I know of a chat, there's been some stuff in the chat, I haven't been able to look at it, but I'd like to hear or read some of the strategies y'all have had for any of these tips, anything you've found that works, anything you've found that you've been struggling with. I'd just like to open it up to conversation so we can hear from one another.
Yeah, Jared, I'm going to give people a chance to type in the chat, but I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and that'll give them an opportunity while I'm doing that. Do you find that reading fiction or nonfiction is more relaxing for you? And
that's a really interesting one, because up until recently, I would have said fiction. Yeah. I have really gotten into reading more nonfiction. Normally it was like a 2-to-1 split for me. I would read like twice as much fiction as nonfiction.
Right.
I think a part of that is with respect to the nonfiction, I've really started to get into fields that are way beyond psychology. Like when I'm reading nonfiction, I don't read psychology ever. I read a lot of history, which I've gotten really into, and it's almost like a release to be thinking about something that's real, that's not now. It also makes me feel like I'm learning something, which is helpful. My wife, on the other hand, who reads probably more than I do, can't stand nonfiction. So I think it probably just varies on the individual preference. She reads only fiction.
Yeah, I think I find fiction more relaxing.
I think that would probably be the general sentiment.
Yeah, maybe it just depends. I know, and I'm like you. I mean, some of my reading is work reading, obviously, probably too much of it, but I try to also read outside my field. So another question I had is the catastrophic thinking. I've noticed that it seems like I tend to fall prey to that more at night.
Yeah.
Is there a psychological reason for that? Is there any research on that you know of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things there. One, at the end of the day, even if it's not necessarily the end of the day, when the sun goes down, our brains respond as though it's the end of the day, right? Biologically, which is why some of y'all might notice you might get sleepy in the early evening when that sun starts to go down. But part of what happens is we are sort of programmed at the end of the day to ruminate, to think about the day. And a part of that means thinking about not just our day, but the larger context in which we're living, right? And a lot of that is negative. So we start to sort of obsess over those things. It's one of the reasons why some of y'all may have experienced this. I experience this relatively frequently. Maybe throughout the day I'm fine. Maybe in the evening I'm fine. I lay down to go to bed, my mind starts to wander.
Yeah.
And where does it go? It either goes to like the 4 things I need to get done or things that wouldn't stress me out in the slightest when I wake up. But at night when I'm trying to fall asleep are the biggest deal in the world.
I
And one
know.
thing that's helped me with that is to try to compartmentalize and think, and it's hard if you're kind of like semi-conscious, but before you're falling asleep to think, look, I know this is bothering me now, but I also know when I wake up, this thing that's stressing me out isn't going to seem like that big of a deal. I'll just do what I need to do to either address it or recognize that there's nothing I can do, so I need to move on from it.
One person said that, or you wake up at 2 a.m. worrying about this stuff.
Oh, I wake up, my sleep was bad before this. Now, and I mean, I've tried all the sleep strategies I know of, but I will wake up 15 to 20 to 30 times throughout the night. And I don't even know if I'm stressed, but I know that I am waking up. And if I wake up enough, like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and the idea pops into my head, falling back asleep is going to be a challenge, right?
Yeah. Jared, so one person in the chat, you may have seen it, but they mentioned that they found prayer to be an important part of their day.
Sure.
So would you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of put prayer into the category of connection and like meditation to a certain extent. It doesn't really matter what your religious views are or beliefs. The idea that you have time to think about something bigger than yourself, whether that's the world around you or whether that's a religious figure, the time you have to just sit and reflect, which prayer can provide, or meditation can provide, or as I mentioned, even reading can provide, that's valuable. It helps us disengage from like the here and now, like what's right in front of us, which can be overwhelmingly negative, right? So there's a reason why for people who are religious, prayer can provide that kind of release, that kind of meditative space that is necessary for them to have a sense of peace in a time when it can be very difficult to find that. So I would encourage anyone, again, whatever their religious views are, to have that time to have that sort of like meditative, quiet, reflective space, whatever that might look like.
Right. Here's Allison Huffy has said that she said, we missed having our family Christmas Eve get together. Instead, we had a family Zoom meeting, which included family out of state. It was wonderful as I was able to see cousins I had not seen for years.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. I did that myself. I got together with a group of guys that I ran cross country in high school with, and a couple of them I hadn't seen for 40 years.
Yeah.
I'm dating myself there, but yeah. But now others, I'd stayed in contact with. But yeah, it was great to see everybody.
That's a good point. I mean, we've lost a lot of connection, but at the same time, I think new connections have been formed as well with those sort of circumstances where it's easier for everyone to connect virtually. So where we may not have seen them or heard from them had it been a face-to-face gathering, we get to connect and see people that who knows when we would have spoken with them again.
Right.
Maybe ever.
Right. Pam Clark has a comment about she feels like, and you can comment on this, that walking hits most of the strategies that you're talking about, just taking a nice walk outside.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I have found walking, I mean, I've always liked walking, hiking, not so much in Texas, but outside hiking is great, but
right.
just walking around my neighborhood is one of the things that I've noticed makes me feel the best, right? I'm not thinking about other things. I'm just enjoying being outside. I'm enjoying getting my heart rate up a little bit, getting outside of the house. It hits on a lot of those. And again, I think it's especially important while we've got the weather to make it feasible to get out as much as possible, because It's tough to get out and walk in August.
Okay, so Jared, here's Kimberly Pruner has a question. She's asked you, what about the old phrase, don't worry about things you can't control? how can you rationalize that in your head, especially when is not something you can control, you know?
It's hard. I mean, it's one of those things that we hear all the time, right? That is absolutely easier said than done. Where they say, I mean, there's plenty of psychological research that shows we're better off if we don't stress about the things that we literally can't do anything about. So we know we shouldn't, right? But we do it anyway. So it's almost about, while we're doing it, trying to remind ourselves that there's nothing we can do about it and focus on the things we can do within that framework. So we think about COVID as a whole, right? It's overwhelming. There's nothing it seems like we can do on a large level to stop things from getting worse. They seem to get worse every week, right? Every day they get worse. It doesn't seem like there's anything we can do to speed up the vaccination process. So focus on what we can do, right? To protect ourselves, to protect others, what we can do to preserve our mental health. It doesn't solve it, because I'll be honest, I get stressed, I get bummed out. Like when the vaccine first got approved, I had this like 1 day high. I was talking to my wife. I was like, we're going to be able to travel this summer. It's going to be great. I was disabused of that notion pretty quickly. And now I've just thought, when they're available, they're available. We'll get them. Until then, I'm just going to try to ignore it and focus on what I know I can do to protect myself and others.
Right. And it's interesting to just elaborate on what Allison put in hers, is that, I mean, even these virtual sessions that we've had, we've had speakers from all over the country that last semester and this semester that we might not have been able to have on campus, but they're willing to do it virtually. So you try to find those advantages or those good things where they exist. Okay, so Juliana has a comment for you where she says, something that has been keeping me sane as an Aspie is thinking about and indulging in fixations.
Okay, so yeah, Juliana, I think, is a former student of mine. Actually, I think she was in my class that got disrupted in the middle of last semester. So that would be a good example of treating yourself, right? In terms of, we don't have to be perfect, right? Allowing ourselves to occasionally indulge in whatever it might be, right? In doing something that we want to do just because we enjoy doing it, right? That's important for our mental health. That's important for maintaining, again, some sense of sanity, whatever that thing might be. Not putting too much pressure on ourselves to like get things done. There was this weird moment early on in quarantine, right, where people were talking about all this extra time they had and all the new things they were learning. And I think, number one, not everyone had all that extra time. And number two, it put a lot of pressure on people like, oh, I haven't learned a new language. I haven't learned this or that. We don't need that. Like, do it if you want to do it. And if not, don't. Carve out time for doing something you just want to do because you enjoy doing it.
Right. Okay, here's Marcia. Marcia Jackson, walking with and training my dogs and taking them to the park has been very beneficial to me. Now, here's a question from Hafsa Lugal. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Who has a question: what alternatives are there if you cannot go out to walk in your neighborhood? What might you suggest?
So it depends on sort of the circumstance that you're in, right? If there's something, this isn't particularly common in Houston, but some of y'all might be familiar with an acronym SAD for seasonal affective disorder, which is something that is pretty common in the Midwest, the Northwest, and the Northeast during the winter months where they don't get a lot of sunlight. It's essentially a minor form of depression. Now, when I say minor, that's not to trivialize it. It can make us feel listless. It can make us feel hopeless. It can make us lack energy. And the reason I mention that is I think there might be a component to that that's going on for people right now, even in climates like Texas, that's not as linked to the season, but linked to the fact that maybe we can't get outside or can't interact in the ways that we would normally do.
Yeah.
So in terms of getting the benefits of going outside, one of those would be getting your heart rate up. So anything you could do inside to get your heart rate up would help a bit. You don't even have to have exercise equipment to do that. I mean, this is weird, but just doing some push-ups to get your heart rate going, it makes your mind focus on the pain that you're experiencing in the moment. And that it can be sort of a temporary high that can last 15 minutes to half an hour. I'm trying to think of something to do that's more.
Well, you said it earlier,
maybe just outside.
But just sitting on your back porch, might be.
What if you don't have a back porch?
I know. Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah.
I mean, go out for a drive with the windows down.
Marcia suggested yoga.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And Hope suggested yoga inside the house.
Very good.
Dave, my brother-in-law, Dave's wants you to elaborate this distinction between managing stress, not solving stress. And can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. Essentially, it's the distinction between trying to fix a problem and trying to adjust the way we feel about the problem. This is something that typically, as we get older, we get better at doing. Not necessarily, but just on average. So it's the idea that, look, there's sort of two categories of stressors, right? There's the category of stressors that you can address. There's stuff stressing you out that you can do something about. If it's work that you need to get done, if it's taxes you need to file. I don't know why that's what popped into my head, but something is stressing you out that you could take action. There's a whole nother category of stressors that we have no control over, right? The ones we've kind of been focusing on. So changing the way that we feel about those, the way we think about those, the way we approach those is what I'm talking about when I'm saying changing our approach to stress versus changing like actually addressing the stress. Now, obviously, that's easier said than done, but it is something that is possible. It's something called cognitive restructuring. It's the idea that if you get into the habit of forcing yourself to think about something in a way that's slightly different than the way maybe you've previously approached it, you can literally, and I do mean literally, rewire your brain. You can change the neural connections such that that thing that you might that might nag at you, that might stress you out, that you can't do anything about, that you know you shouldn't focus on, eventually might not become that big of a deal. It's sort of the approach they take when they're treating certain psychological disorders with cognitive behavioral therapy. And right. We can take that kind of approach and just apply it to our everyday lives. I've done this in the workplace. There's stuff my first few years with students that would stress me out, that I knew there's nothing I could do about. I've done everything I could do. And I would tell myself, I just need to stop obsessing over this. And it took a long time. It took years, but by years of just thinking about it differently, approaching it differently, now I see when those things happen, I don't think twice about them. They're not a stressor anymore. So something that used to be in that category of stress I can't do anything about has been sort of shoved off to the side.
Okay, a couple of people, I think it's Traquil Freeman, suggests that this person who wants to, who can't go outdoors, to maybe try YouTube. They have a lot of exercise classes. And
that'd be a good way to connect too.
And Kim Sharp suggested jumping jacks and other calisthenic exercises. Eldridge asked this question. I'm a 43-year-old student and also a full-time employee in corporate America. In your opinion, what's the happy medium between being safe in the pandemic and capitalism? That's an easy one.
Oh, good Lord. I want to get myself in trouble here because I have, it's hard. There's a lot of people's lives have been very disrupted. A lot of people's livelihoods have been lost. A lot of people's lives have been destroyed, right, by the economic consequences of this. At the same time, a lot of people have literally died as a result of this. So it is about trying to find a happy medium between safety and, I don't want to say it's not stability. It's almost two forms of safety. It's health safety, and it's, to a certain extent, financial safety and economic stability and economic safety. And quite frankly, I don't think anyone has the right answer for that. It's something that unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess I should say, as humans, we don't have a lot of experience with this in terms of a pandemic on this scale. We don't have any modern experience with it, with the modern economy and how this affects people. I think the people that are in charge of some of these decisions need to keep all aspects in mind when they're reaching the decisions in terms of what they should do and the support that needs to be provided for people that might not be receiving the support that they need. Fortunately, when I'm thinking about like my fellow faculty and we're in a pretty good situation in terms of that support, where we have been able to continue our jobs. We've been able to function. We've been able to continue to get paid while also staying completely safe. I know for a lot of other people, that's not the case. I mean, even my wife, she's been in the classroom now face to face since September. And that's a good example potentially of this tension. You want to keep everyone safe, right? But you also need students to be in schools, right? Mm-hmm. So fortunately, it appears that the science is sort of falling in on the side of schools, when masks are worn, when proper measures are taken, are a relatively safe space at that level, not potentially at the college level because spread is higher there. But so finding that balance, I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think it's going to depend on the circumstance and treating circumstances as individual circumstances rather than a blanket approach.
I don't think we have any more questions or comments. I hope I've gotten to everybody's stuff. While we wait to see if there's any final questions, I'd like to mention to everybody again, we have another of these talks on Tuesday night, and it's again a philosophy professor, Jim Schwartz from Wichita State, and going to talk about space travel and how we need to rethink it or think about it differently. And his focus on the sci-fi series, The Expanse, which I promise everybody here that is a good escape. Series, really good stuff. And I'd also, again, recommend, you can find it on our YouTube channel, Professor Miller's lecture on creativity and space. It's called if you just Google From the Page to the Moon, Jared Miller, it'll come up. And it's a great talk on the importance of imagination in creating a different world, really, not just space travel, but creating a different world. And okay, so one final question, the last thing that someone asked, and this is a good positive note because it's looking forward, and Hope's question is top 3 places you're going to go once this is over.
Okay, that is good. It fills me with happiness just to think about it, right? Right. Number 1 is Japan. We were scheduled to go to Japan last June. Obviously, that did not happen. Number 2 is London because it's our favorite city in the world. I want to get back there. And
we need to talk about that. That's our favorite too.
Oh yeah, I absolutely love it. And number 3, I guess I haven't thought that far in advance. Probably Prague. I'll just throw Prague in there.
All right. A lot of good comments. Dave wanted to add his 3 places are Germany, Britain, and Colorado. A lot of comments on just thanking us. This has been a wonderful conversation. We do these every week now, folks, the rest of the semester, and we hope to see you. Just a lot of thank yous, Jared. So
sure.
And Jared, by the way, now that we're make sure and send me the PowerPoint so Jose can integrate it into the recording. All right. Thanks, everybody. Great start to the semester. Bye-bye.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.